Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the distinguished lecture series of the Access Linnaeus Center. It's my honor to introduce Professor Stephen Lowe from California Institute of Technology. Professor Stephen Lowe came to KTH today for the PhD defense of Sindre Magnusson, and he acted as PhD opponent, and during the opposition was very evident the exceptional, I would say, pedagogical skills that I also noticed many years ago when I was a young researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. At the entrance of the School of Electrical Engineering, there is a list of the best teacher PhD students per year, and I noticed his name 15 years ago. Many knows, of course, Professor Stephen Lowe for his exceptional work in the area of TCP, in the area of networking, both theoretical and applied. And among other things, he's a co-founder of a company, FastSoft, that has had a tremendous impact in the real world. Is listed among the best 500 Fortune companies, and actually we can say that every second the research results of Professor Stephen Lowe are tremendously increasing the efficiency of the internet of the order of 1 terabyte per second. And please.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the invitation. It's great to be here. Honored to be here. I came here, I think, gave a same lecture in the same room many years ago. So it's great to be back. So I'll talk about optimal power flow, which is, we'll see what the problem is. And it's a joint work with many people in the last few years, and I'll come back to this slide in a moment. So we are at a watershed moment where if we look at the largest infrastructure that human ever built, both appear around 140 years ago. It's a communication network, which is a telephone network at the time, and also the AC transmission network, the electric network. And both started in a very similar engineering, economic, and regulatory environment to provide single commodity extremely reliably. Both grew rapidly through the two wars, post-war, and both even started to deregulate around the same time. So the development have been very parallel until about 20 plus years ago, when the telephone network, communication network, took a turn and had an architectural transformation and evolved into the internet. The internet really has become a platform for innovation with impacts way beyond communications. The hope is that in the coming decades, a similar architectural transformation will appear in electric network, perhaps evolve into the largest and most complex Internet of Things. So there are many forces that are driving these changes. And if we look at how the communication network has evolved in the last 20 plus years, some of the biggest companies in IT did not exist 20 years ago. I think earlier, about a month ago, the 5 largest companies by market capitalization have become the ones, Facebook, Google, Amazon, those companies that we hear daily but didn't exist about 20 years ago. Except Apple, that has transformed tremendously. So if we look at the power system, then the grid, even today, looks something like this. We have a large centralized generators. In the US, it's about 10,000 or so large generators. And then we may have hundreds of millions or billions endpoints that are just passive loads. All they do is consume. We don't really control that much, except, say, during emergencies, load sheddings, and so on. All the controls are concentrated at those few large control points, these generators. So they are actively controlled, actively monitored, and they drive the dynamics of the network. Indeed, the control paradigm for the last 100 years or so has been that we forecast demand, which actually is very predictable at the aggregate level, and then we schedule supply to meet them. Now, going forward, perhaps the network, the hope is that we change into a very different architecture, that we still may have the similar structure today, but adding on top of that, we'll have a lot more distributed energy resources. So this may be wind turbines, solar PVs, electric vehicles, smart buildings, smart appliances, power electronics, and so on. So unlike endpoints today that are just passive loads, these are intelligent endpoints that not only consume, some may generate, some may measure, compute, communicate naturally. And therefore, we have a very active network in the future. With such a network, it comes both with risk and opportunity. It's a risk because many of these distributed energy resources will generate random, large, frequent fluctuations in supply, in demand, in voltage, and frequency. And therefore, if we don't control it correctly, we may have blackouts and problems much more frequently than we do today. Yet these are intelligent endpoints that will allow us to improve the efficiency, the security, and reliability of the system if we control correctly. So that's the challenge, that we need to have a much more distributed real-time feedback paradigm that will match the flexible demands, which we have not explored much, in order to match volatile supplies. So this is the sort of high-level, big picture under which we are interested in some of the technical challenges. And I will talk about 3 pieces of work if we have time, and if not, I will just skip the third one. The first 2 pieces are concerns with the steady-state behavior of the network, what's called the optimal power flow problem. And we will see what it is and why that is important. And the second piece, or the third piece, is this frequency control that describes the fast dynamics of the network at the timescales of, say, seconds or so. One thing that runs through both pieces is sort of the underlying computational challenges that arise because of laws of physics. So one important difference between physical network and cyber network is that in a cyber physical network, there are laws of physics that we cannot design away. And sometimes that creates the computational challenges that we have to address. Okay, so of the 3 pieces of work, the first piece, which has to do with how do we deal with non-convexity of optimal power flow problems. Many people contributed towards that work, and here's some of them. Both was a former PhD student at UIUC, Professor Manny Chandy, Fariva, who was a PhD student before, Ling Wengang, who was a PhD student, Javad Lavaya, who was a PhD student of John Doyle. We worked together on power systems, and he's now at faculty at Berkeley. And then the second piece is the work of Ling Wengang in part of his small part of his PhD thesis, and DJ, who was a postdoc, now with PNNL, and Yu Jietang, who is still a PhD student at Caltech. And then if we do have time, I'll talk about the third piece of work, which looks at the fast timescale dynamics in the network, joint work with Janusz Baglev, who is director of the energy systems at Scotech, Lina Lee, who that works closely with Carlo, Enrique Majeda. He was a PhD at Cornell, postdoc at Caltech, and now a faculty at Johns Hopkins. Ufu Toku, who was a postdoc at Caltech, and now faculty at Austin. And my PhD student, Zhang Hongzhao, who's now at NREL. Okay, so optimal power flow problem is extremely important. It is a problem that is being solved every day, every hour, every, say, 15 minutes or so around the world to, for example, set how we operate the engineering of the network, but also set how we set the prices for electricity in the network. It is important because many of the power system operation and planning operations, underlying that is this constraint optimization. It's first formulated in 1962, is well known, a lot of literature, but if you look at what the most common way people actually solve it in practice is to solve a linearization. Then you get a linear program, you can solve it, and then you can apply your control to the network. depending on the applications you're looking at. But all sorts of nonlinear algorithms have been tried on OPF. And it takes the form where we want to minimize certain costs, C of X, subject to two sets of constraints in the simplest form. One is described by this nonlinear equality constraint that describes the power flow on the network. So that's where the laws of physics comes in. The second set of constraints typically takes some box constraint, which are things such as we want to make sure the voltage magnitude in the network stays within, say, 5% of its nominal value. Or the power flow on the line, the currents on the line, for example, stays within a certain thermal limits and so on. So in practice, depending on the applications, the OPF takes a lot more complicated than this simple form. You could have, say, discrete variables, for example. But we're going to focus on the simplest form where there's only two sets of constraints, power flow constraint and then operational constraint. So we'll see more details of that in a moment. So the underlying computational challenge is that the nonlinear power flow equations, say, quadratic equations in general, makes the feasible set non-convex. So this is a famous picture by Ian Hiskins that looks at, in a very simple setting, just 3 buses, 1 generator on each, and if you project to, say, this 3-dimensional space in some of the variables, you get this feasible set that looks either beautiful or ugly. It's very challenging if we want to find the global optimal within this feasible set. So that's the computational challenge that we'll focus on. And the 2 ideas that we try, one is to look at semi-definite relaxation. That is the computational challenge for the simple OPF problem that we look at. All the complexity is in the feasible set. So instead of trying to minimize the cost over this non-convex feasible set, you can minimize over a larger convex superset. And the hope is that when you solve this simpler problem, once you get the optimal solution, you can somehow recover the optimal solution of your original non-convex problem. So we'll see how we might do that. And the second idea is that the network is actually solving power flow equations in real time for free. And therefore, for the applications that we have, if we can exploit the network as a power flow equation solver, then perhaps we can do that. So the first 2 parts basically go into the details of these 2 ideas. Okay, so let's go into a bit of a technical detail, but the details are not too important. So I'll point out the structure and the ideas behind them. So this is an OPF problem where we want to minimize a certain cost function. The variables are, there's a network with n nodes or n buses. At each node, there's this voltage phasor, Vi, at every node I. So it's a complex quantity that denotes the voltage phasor. There's also a injection, net injection, which is if the network is a generator network, then how much real and reactive power that's generated at that node. If the node is a load, say electric vehicle, then what is the real and reactive power withdrawn from that node? So everything, all the variables are complex, and therefore we have these 2 n-dimensional vectors, the power injection S and the voltage phasor in Cn. And we want to minimize a certain cost, which can represent the generation cost, it can represent the network power loss, real power loss, or it can represent some kind of a user utility, for example. And typically, for the kind of cost that we're interested in, we can express that as a quadratic function of, say, the voltage phasor vector. So C is a positive definite matrix, V is the column vector of voltage phasor, and VH is the row complex conjugate, Hermitian transpose of this voltage vector. And therefore, VVH is a rank 1 matrix. Multiplied by the cost matrix, you get a n by n matrix. You take the trace, which is the sum of diagonal elements. So typically, you get a convex objective function. And then the 2 sets of constraints, one is the power flow equation. So this simply is a power balance. That is, at each node J, the net power injection, real and reactive power injection at node J, is related to the voltages in the entire network through this quadratic formula. Again, it's a power balance, just Kirchhoff law. Yj depends on the topology of the network. So given the network, we know its topology, we know its impedance values on all the lines. So that can be represented by a admittance matrix, some matrix Y, complex n by n matrix. From that Y matrix, you can obtain another matrix Yj, one for each j. Okay? And therefore, at each node j, there's a certain Yj that's given. And again, you get this RAM1 matrix, and this represents the power flow equation. And the important thing to notice is that Yj is typically not positive semi-definite. It's not even Hermitian. And that is where we get non-convexity. We get this quadratic equality constraint, which is non-convex. And then the operational constraints typically take these box constraints. So this is actually quadratic, but it depending on the different forms one can formulate the OPF, you can have simple box constraints or quadratic box constraints. So this represents that if it's a generator, for example, Sj has a huge generator, then this can represent the capacity of the generation. So it's a complex number. This represents two sets of equalities. The constraint on the real power, constraint on the reactive power. Similarly, this is the voltage constraint. Okay, so that's the problem. And again, for this simple form, all the complexity lies in this quadratic equality that creates this non-convex feasible set. So Yj again is not positive semi-definite. So we get this non-convex QCQP. How do we deal with that? Again, look at the first idea, which is we can try to solve a semi-definite realization of this problem. So the idea is, so this is the OPF that we just formulated. We can eliminate Sj by just substituting Sj into here. And therefore, the entire problem becomes a problem that involves only the voltage vector. Right? So that's this. That we want to minimize over the voltage vector subject to this quadratic equation in voltage, satisfy the bounds that represents the generation bounds, for example. So, okay, so the structure is that everywhere the voltage variable appears, it appears as VVH quadratically. And therefore, and this is just a RAM1 matrix, and therefore we can formulate the problem equivalently as a minimization over a matrix W, right? Everywhere you see VVH, you replace by a matrix, VVH, and therefore here becomes this constraint, and then not any n by n matrix, it has to be positive semi-definite and RAM1. The important thing is that while the original problem is quadratic in V, the lifted version will be linear in W. So this is the Kirchhoff law. And then you have a convex constraint on the W matrix, and then this is the non-convexity. So that's the idea. These two are equivalent in the sense that if you look at the feasible set or the solution set, there's a 1-1 correspondence between the feasible solutions here and the feasible solutions here. And therefore, if we can solve this, it's equivalent to solving this. Given an optimal solution of W star that satisfy these conditions, PSD and RAM1, we can determine the optimal solution V for the original problem, up to a phased shift. Okay, so this is the only non-convexity. And therefore, if we look at the feasible set, the set of voltages satisfy the OPF constraints, and the set of W that satisfy that linear constraint plus PSC RAM1, they are equivalent in the sense of one-to-one mapping. And relaxation corresponds to just ignoring this RAM constraint. Then we get a convex problem. We can try to minimize our cost over this relaxed space, W star. When we get an optimal solution, then we check whether the optimal W star turns out to have RAM1. If it is of RAM1, then we can uniquely recover an optimal solution for the original problem. So this is QP with n variables. n complex variables, but now we have n squared. For large network, this is a lot bigger, and therefore it's not practical to solve, especially if we want to solve in real time for a large network. So the next idea in trying to reduce the problem size with the relaxation is that, so this is what we had. This is the voltage feasible set for the original OPF problem. This is the feasible set for the equivalent problem where the variables are the PSD RAM1 matrices. So the idea is that if we look at, say, the linear constraint that describes the Kirchhoff law, not every entry in W appears in the Kirchhoff law. In fact, only those entries, the off-diagonal entries, Wij, that corresponds to a line that connecting node I and node J appears. If there's no line between two nodes I and J, then the corresponding Wij does not appear in the Kirchhoff law. And therefore, instead of solving for the entire n square, the entire matrix with n square entries, we can solve for what's called a partial matrix. That is, we will only solve for the diagonal entries, the n of them, and then those off-diagonal entries that corresponds to lines in the network. Now, the practical network is very sparse. Instead of n square lines, if you look at the practical network, is, for example, for IEEE test systems, is less than 1.6n. So it's a fraction of n's, linear in n. And therefore, the partial matrix WG is much smaller for practical networks than the entire matrix. And therefore, the idea is that perhaps we can, instead of trying to solve for the entire matrix, we can solve for this much smaller partial matrix. And the partial matrix will satisfy the same set of linear constraints that describes the Kirchhoff law, but also this constraint that involves every entry in W will become a much smaller set of constraints. So this simply says, if JK are connected, so for each line JK, we look at the WJK, which is a 2x2 matrix. We require those 2x2 matrices to be PSD and RAM1. A much simpler PSD RAM1 condition than for the entire matrix. And then there's another condition that's a cycle condition, which looks something like this. It says, for the JK entry, you get a complex number. You look at the phase of that complex number. And then if you look at all the off-diagonal entries that correspond to line JK, go around any loop, the phase has to sum to 0. It has to do with the sum of the angle differences around a loop is sums to 0, basically. The interesting thing with this is that this set of constraints are local. It involves only variables at two ends of a line. And therefore, for this set of constraints, we can relatively easily get distributed algorithms say for real-time optimization in the future. But this cycle condition is difficult. It's not only non-convex, it's also global. So it's non-local. So that's the huge challenge. But in any case, we could indeed prove that not only are these two sets, feasible sets equivalent, they're also equivalent with this feasible set in the previous slide that involve only the partial matrix, much smaller variables. So again, these sets are equivalent in the sense of one correspondence between them. And given any partial matrix, there is only a unique completion to the full matrix from which you can extract the voltage vector. And therefore, it says that instead of minimizing the cost over this feasible set, we could minimize the cost over this feasible set or this feasible set. They're all equivalent, and you can translate between them, except that all of these are non-convex. But we can look at where the non-convexity is and just ignore them. That's the relaxation. Right? So here, the SDP relaxation we saw before, we ignore the RAM1. For this partial matrix, we can ignore RAM1 and this complicated cycle constraint. Then we get a SOCP, second order cone relaxation, which is much simpler than the SDP relaxation, typically orders of magnitude faster in solution time. So this is the pictorial representation of what I said in the previous slide, that this is SDP relaxation we saw before. Instead of minimizing the cost over this non-convex W feasible set, we can minimize over the relaxed convex superset. So that's SDP relaxation. Similarly here, instead of minimizing over this non-convex set of partial matrices, we can minimize over a bigger set, which is this second-order cone relaxation. If the network, what's called a radial network, that is, if the topology is a tree, then this collapse, that is the SOCP relaxation, will be equivalent to SDP relaxation. Again, in the sense of there's one correspondence between the two sets. And there, if it's a mesh network, then this is strictly bigger than the SDP feasible set, which means that if we have what's called a radial network, a tree topology, then never solve SDP, we should always solve SOCP. It's orders of magnitude faster, but have the same tightness. Right, okay. So who cares about radial network? Well, it turns out almost all distribution systems, almost all distribution networks in the grid have tree topology. And most of the smart grid innovations will probably appear first in distribution systems. And therefore, this turns out to be a very important type of networks that happens to have this nice relaxation property. Okay, we'll come back to this point later on. And therefore, the strategy is that we have this non-convex problem that we don't know how to solve. Instead of solving this, we can solve a relaxation. Once we get an optimal solution of the relaxed problem, let's say if it's SDP, that means we get a matrix solution. If it's SOCP, you can think of it as we get a partial matrix. Then we can check some simple conditions. Say in SDP, we can check whether the optimal matrix has rank 1. In the case of SOCP, we get a partial matrix. We can check whether for every line, there's a corresponding 2x2 matrix, whether that 2x2 matrix is rank 1. And then we check the cycle condition. So there's a set of simple checkable conditions. If they are satisfied, then we can recover the optimal solution of the original OPF problem. Now, if they are not satisfied, then we are stuck. It's not very clear what we will do. So in wireless, for example, if we do the SDP relaxation, we get a non-rank 1 solution, it actually tells us what to do. So you can time share, say, in power control context, and that will be optimal. In power system, it's not very clear, because if it's not rank 1, it means the solution doesn't satisfy Kirchhoff law. We cannot implement them. So, okay, and therefore the exact relaxation becomes important. That is, we want to make sure we solve a relaxation, we can actually get an optimal solution that satisfies, say, the rank 1 constraint. There's no guarantee we can always do it. It is an NP-hard problem. People have formally proved OPF is NP-hard. And therefore, we don't expect to be able to always solve the relaxation exactly. And here's one condition, a sufficient condition that guarantee if our problem satisfies, the problem data satisfies certain conditions, then SDP relaxation or SOCP relaxation always work. It looks like the following. So OPF, again, is a QCQP, non-convex QCQP, which takes this form, right? It's specified by the cost matrix, which is typically convex, PSD, and then minimize this quadratic objective function. X is in n-dimensional complex vector, subject to, again, the quadratic condition less than BK. So specify C, cost matrix, CK, the constraint matrix, it specifies the QCQP. There's also a parameter that is BK that does not appear in the condition. So given a QCQP that is given a set of matrices, it defines an underlying graph. But now you can just think of the underlying graph for OPF problem is the network graph. Right? And therefore, given a QCQP, there is an underlying graph. If that underlying graph is a tree, then we say it's a QCQP over tree. Right? So given this problem, I look at the underlying graph. If it's a tree, then it is the problem set, the class of problems that we're interested in. The sufficient condition looks like the following. We look at QCQP over tree. So it's a radio network in our context. And then this one condition we can check. It looks like it goes like the following. For every line in the network, ij, you look at Cij, which is a cost function. So the ij's entry, off-diagonal entry of this cost matrix. You look at the ij's entry of the ck matrix. So you get k plus 1 complex numbers. For every line, you get k plus 1 complex numbers. The phase of those complex numbers are important, but not the magnitude. And therefore, you can represent these k plus 1 complex numbers are a unit circle in a complex plane, right? Ignore the magnitude. The condition is that if all the k plus 1 complex numbers are linearly separable, that is, lies on one side of a line, any line that goes to the origin, right? It looks the picture like this, right? Then SOCP realization is always exact. So if my OPF problem satisfies this condition, then I know I can just solve the SOCP. I will always get an optimal solution, global optimal solution for the original OPF. So this is for general QCQP. Given the matrices, you can check. What does that mean in OPF? Well, it means in OPF, it has something to do with the constraints. So remember, one of the constraints in OPF is that if you look at the real and reactive power generation or injection at each node, it has to satisfy some certain lower bound and certain upper bound. Now, if the lower bound, upper bound always finite or tight required every node, then it does not satisfy the sufficient condition. On the other extreme, for example, there's no lower bound on the injection, or there's no upper bound on the injection, or more generally, some conditions on the bounds such that the corresponding ij entry of the corresponding matrices lies on one side, then you satisfy. So it has to do with, we cannot require all upper and lower bounds on all the real and reactive power at every node to be finite. We have to give us something in order to satisfy the sufficient condition. But it's only sufficient. People actually also have looked at IEEE test systems where the sufficient condition is not satisfied. Then interestingly, very often, STP realization will still work. We don't quite understand why. It also has to do with, so where do the numbers come from? It comes from the impedance of the line. So the passivity of the line actually gives us some property that seems to make the realization work. So it really comes from the physics. So mathematically, here's one example. There's some simple 3-bus network, and this is what happened at the realization. If you project to the right spaces, this is some real power at node 1, real power at node 2. The feasible set is this black line, black curve. It's not convex. STP realization corresponds to this purple region that contains the black curve, which is convex. Right? And therefore, if we want to minimize the cost over the black curve is non-convex, but we minimize over the purple region is a convex problem. In SOCP realization, then we minimize over the yellow region that contains the purple region. So that's the realization. Now, if we blow up this part, then we will see that the purple region actually has the black curve as its boundary. And therefore, if the cost level set goes like this, and we are trying to minimize, then when we minimize over the purple region, the optimal solution actually lies on the black curve. And that's where the exactness comes from. So we can minimize over the purple region, we will get an optimal point that lies on the original non-convex feasible set. That's the black curve. But if we enlarge this set, then we will see that the yellow region strictly contains the black curve. And therefore, if we try to solve, minimize over the SOCP feasible set, we will get an optimal point that will not lie on the black curve. That's why SOCP relaxation for this mesh network will not work. You will always get you get a solution which doesn't satisfy the equivalent RAM1 constraint. Okay, so this whole theory developed for the semi-definite relaxations under what conditions you'll be exact, and you can build on top of that. So there's a lot of very interesting work that build on top of that looks at, suppose you do SDP is not exact, what can you do? Well, you can go up the polynomial hierarchy and get tighter relaxations at the cost of computational complexity. And there are different ideas that people have tried to manage the complexity, the growth of this complexity. There are also other relaxations and other nonlinear optimization techniques one can try and use on this non-convex problem, the global optimization problems. One can look at different applications, say electric vehicle charging, for example, or demand response, where you include the network as your constraint, so the optimal power flows. And you can also try to look at the convex problem and say, can you solve in a distributed manner, assuming relaxation will work? And then the other cases where you can try to improve the realism of the model, so what's called the unbalanced case, and so on. Okay, so that's the semi-definite relaxation, the first idea to deal with non-convexity. So let me tell you the second idea, the online algorithm. So again, this is what we just covered. That is, instead of solving the original non-convex OPF, we can solve relaxation and hope when we get an optimal X hat star, it satisfies, say, the Riemann condition, right? But all of these traditional algorithms, including these semi-definite relaxations, are offline, which means that for the applications that we're interested in, say, I want to schedule generation, we can formulate the problem, solve iteratively, either through relaxation or not. You can just solve this directly, right? So Newton-Raphson. We can solve it iteratively until it converges. Then we apply our control to the network. So in economic dispatch, it means that we would determine how much each generator will generate. Right? And then because assuming the model is accurate enough, then we know that when we apply the control, which is what is the generation for the generators, then the resulting voltages in the network will satisfy, say, the voltage constraints. Right? Even though we don't directly control some of the variables in the network, say the voltage or line flows in the network, we know, assuming the models are reasonable, that when we apply the control we have, the variables that we don't control directly will indeed be determined by the solution of our optimization. So that's where the offline comes in. But they're not very suitable for perhaps some of the future applications where we're interested in real-time optimization of a large number of distributed energy resources. Right? So that's the motivation. And the idea is the following. So again, we're interested in some of the future applications where we need to do real-time optimization at scale. And the computation, one of the perhaps most important computational challenge that come from laws of physics is that we have to somehow implicitly or explicitly deal with or solve power flow equations, which is difficult. But the network computes power flow solutions in real time at scale for free. And therefore, if for our application we can exploit it, then we should. And if we design the algorithm from that, we will naturally get an algorithm that will adapt to changing network conditions. So that's the idea. So I will give you two examples, perhaps maybe one, probably one that I will have time. And the first example is basically OPF. How do we solve OPF in that kind of environment? Right? And I will probably skip another example, which is the fast time scale behavior of the network in the context of frequency control. Right? So let's look at online OPF. Okay. So again, this is the problem we had before. It's a static OPF problem that we solved before, right, through relaxation. So in general, it takes the following form, that suppose we have a certain variables that are controllable. So this could be controllable loads, electric vehicles, for example. And there are certain variables that are not controllable, say the voltages voltage phase in the network, for example, or power flow in the lines and so on. So the OPF is to minimize a certain cost as a function of controllable variables and uncontrollable states. Subject to two sets of constraints. One is the power flow equation, quadratic, non-convex, non-linear. And then operational constraints, which are simple box constraints. So the key assumption we make is that if we apply the control X, there will be a unique solution Y that will satisfy power flow equations. There's some kind of an implicit function theorem, right? We suppose that holds. Now in practice, at least during normal operations, that is the case. You apply your control, the network is going to settle down into some steady state. Right? Now the steady state may or may not satisfy the operational constraints, but there should be a solution for the power flow equations. So this is, and therefore mathematically, we can write Y as a function of X and eliminate Y from this problem, and therefore we get a problem in terms of X only. That looks like this. So we want to minimize a certain cost as a function of X only, subject to this nonlinear constraint. So instead of the original simple box constraint, now we get this non-convex constraint because Y of X is typically nonlinear. And then still this simple constraint. So in this problem, the objective function is complicated, typically non-convex, and this constraint is complicated. So one way to deal with this, not the only way, is to say, okay, let me just take the complicated constraint and put it as a penalty, right? And therefore, we get this form where we want to minimize some non-convex objective function, complicated, characterized by this mu, which is penalty parameter, subject to a very simple box constraint X. Suppose that's the problem we try to solve. So don't solve this problem, let's suppose we solve this. Okay? So this is just nonlinear optimization. The simplest thing to do is just do the gradient. Right? And therefore the idea is that in each step, you compute one gradient step. First order, second order, doesn't matter. You compute a gradient step, and then you apply the control. Don't wait until the iteration converges. You apply the control. The network is going to solve the power flow equation and produce a YT. Now we have to measure the YT, communicate it back to this. So there's a whole set of issues in this kind of control framework. We need to be able to measure the right thing. We need to be able to communicate and centralize, compute the next gradient step. Now, in practice, we're interested in distributed solutions and so on. So let's put aside these sort of important questions, right? And therefore, the think of we can measure anything we need to measure. We can communicate everything to a centralized location and then centrally compute the gradient, suppose. And therefore, it's conceptually very simple. You compute the gradient, apply to the network. The network is going to solve power flow equations. You do the measurement, and then you repeat the cycle. Okay? And therefore, you explicitly exploit the network as power flow solution solver, and naturally tracks the network, changing network conditions. So we'll be more precise in a moment. So this is very much a feedback control perspective. Okay, so let me describe two things. One is that suppose we have this static OPF that we have been solving, right? So there's one static OPF, but you're trying to use the network to help solve it. And you can do it with the first order conditions. What can we say about that? And then the second thing is how well does it track? Well, it turns out, not surprisingly, first order algorithms may not track very well. So that motivates the second order algorithms that try to track better. And what can we say about the tracking performance? So let me start with this static OPF. So again, this is a problem that we try to solve. We want to minimize a certain cost function f, which can be nonlinear, non-convex, and all, over the simple feasible set. And all we do is this very simple gradient projection algorithm. Right? So we start with a certain point x of t. We compute the gradient of this function as a derivative with respect to x. And then we go in the negative direction with a certain step size. And then we project to this simple box constraint. Right? So In each step, you compute the gradient direction, you apply your control to the network will solve OPF, it gives us a Y, and then you measure Y and you repeat. What is hidden here is that Y appears in F and therefore appears in the gradient. So this assumes we know the network topologies and so on. Okay? So there's a whole set of issues. What if we don't, right? Can you somehow do it with partial information and so on? But that's the simple gradient algorithm. It's a gradient algorithm, and therefore under appropriate assumptions, it's going to converge to some local optimal. Under certain conditions, the local results becomes global. So these are the conditions. For those that are interested in power system, this is the real power at the substation of a distribution system. So this real power can be expressed as a function of the controllable variables, which are, say, the injections. Right? And at each node K, bus K, there's a voltage magnitude square as a function of the controllable variable X. So, and therefore, these are the uncontrollable states as a function of controllable variable X. Now, the assumption is that if this is convex in X, this is concave in X, then essentially the local results becomes global. That is, the simple gradient algorithm will converge to a set of global optimal. And if the set of global optimal is finite, then XT itself will converge to a global optimal. And then there's some assumption. Okay, so the important question is that, are these assumptions reasonable? And is this, the convex half of the local optimal lies in this set? If this set is tiny, or if the assumptions are not reasonable, then who cares about this result, right? But indeed, A is not tiny. You can choose A to be arbitrarily close to a regional feasible set with increasing computational complexity. But these assumptions, it turns out for each of these functions, you can formulate a very simple OPF. And if you look at the SOCP relaxation for those OPF, if the SOCP relaxation is exact, then these assumptions will be satisfied. But again, there's no guarantee that the SOCP for the set of OPF related to these functions are exact. But again, there are sufficient conditions to guarantee them, and even when the sufficient conditions are not satisfied, empirically it seems that SOCP relaxation, these are for distributions, tree topologies, SOCP relaxations tends to be exact. And therefore, it's probably not unreasonable assumptions. And in fact, okay, so that's the what we can say about, that's what we can say about, about the global optimality. Again, there's no guarantee for, and we'll see some simulations for this, but there's no guarantee that we will achieve global optimality, and therefore we can try to estimate the gap as follows. So take any local optimal, which your algorithm may converge to, take any one, look at any feasible point that is slightly away from the boundary. You can compare the cost of this any local optimal with the cost of this feasible point, any feasible point slightly away from the boundary. And you can bound the gap. So this bound is some messy expression. But if we look at IEEE test systems or some data, power grid data we have from utility companies, then the gap is very small, which seems to suggest that a local minimum is almost as good as any strictly interior feasible point. Now, of course, the global optimal can be at the boundary, right? And therefore, you will lose some, but it seems to suggest that you won't lose that much, which seems to be confirmed by this set of simulations. So this is one of the local feeders, real feeders from Southern California Edison, local utility company. It's about 2,000 buses. And then we take random subsets, subgraphs of that so that we get many different instances, problem instances. So this is if we solve the OPF on this set of networks using SOCP relaxation. We can check the conditions always set, we get the exact solution. And therefore, we know these are global optimal, and this is the computation time. And this is the simple gradient algorithms that I described earlier. So this is the objective value from the gradient algorithm. This is the computation time. Error is the difference between the two objective values. So essentially, they get the same performance. But the computational, the speed up can be significant for large networks. Okay, so that's the case when we have a static OPF and we want to solve it. Okay, so I will speed up we should be done in a few minutes. So what if the OPF problem changes? Right? So you, H time t, you compute a gradient step, you apply to the network OPF changes. Right? And can you track? So this is a static problem that we have been considering. Now suppose H time t, the problem changes, and suppose there's a parameter gamma t that changes over time. So this can be, say, the generation, solar generation that changes over time. Or this can be the demands that changes over time. And therefore, each time t, you get a different OPF problem. Okay? So we want to see if we just apply this algorithm, how well it tracks. But the first order algorithm doesn't seem to track very well. So let's look at the second order algorithm. So again, this is the problem that we try to solve. Right? So you eliminate the uncontrollable variables y, you put the penalty constraint on y as a penalty, then you get this problem OPF. We try to solve H time t. So instead of the original first order gradient, you just scale it with some approximate Hessian, or inverse of the approximate inverse Hessian. Okay, so let's say we just do this. Everything else is the same, except you scale the gradient by some matrix. How well does it track? So suppose at every time t, somehow we can solve the OPF problem to global optimal, that is x star. Compare with the xt produced by the second order algorithm. Right? You just look at the norm over time and average over time, or a certain time horizon. Then you can bound this error by this expression. Let me just describe what it says. Right? The details are not important. You have three factors. So the bound has three factors, which all seems to make sense. One is that how fast the problem changes from time t-1 to t, as measured by the optimal solution, say it's the global optimal solution for OPF each time. If the problem is static, doesn't change, then the optimal solution doesn't change over time, this gets 0. This term has to do with when we apply a control at t-1, and then at time t, the problem changes. Our control at t-1 becomes the initial point for the problem at time t. How far is that initial point from the global optimal at time t? That is this delta. Again, it's a measure of how fast the problem changes. The second piece has to do with mainly we are using approximate Hessian. How big is the error? And the third condition has to do with how well conditioned the problem is, as measured by the condition number of the Hessian. And therefore, if the problem doesn't change very fast, if our approximate Hessian is accurate enough, and if the problem is well conditioned, then we can try very well. Okay, so let me just show you one simulation. So you can implement this second order using LBFGS, and then let's take the IEEE test system, 300 buses, and so on. So there are actually two curves. So the curves are the objective function. The problem changes each time. So each time you get an objective value. The blue curve is if we solve the OPF H time t optimally versus if we just take one step, second order, the Hessian approximate Newton step. The two almost coincide. Right? So if you look at the difference, you blow up the difference, again, the gap is very, very small. So you can track pretty well. This spikes corresponds to when you try to push, then sometimes, so this is time. This is over 12 hours. 12 hours, 6 hours. But when you try to push, then sometimes it pushes some of the voltages towards the boundary. And then because we don't have hard constraint on the voltages, it becomes a penalty. And that's where the cost spikes. Okay, I think I'm done. I will skip the last part. Again, the conclusion from this is that, let me just go to the, bear with me, let me go to the final message. Okay, right. Is that that the network is solving powerful equations for us for free at scale in real time, and therefore we should try to exploit that, and we will naturally get a algorithm that will track. Okay, I will close with just this one slide where indeed some of the ideas can be used in practice, and we built a smart EV charging testbed at Caltech that you can optimize, and you can get interesting results. Okay, thank you very much.
Questions from the audience?
With the closest convex set, the original problem. So at this moment, do people know when it is not possible to reduce that set? I mean, you know, ideally you will have a non-convex set, right? Then ideally there are two things. One is, can I find the convex set, I mean a convex problem, that is the closest in the sense that my augmented constraint set is this, you know, absolutely the smallest possible set in volume to the initial non-convex set.
Right. So for general optimization problem, that doesn't seem to be feasible because we know the smallest convex set is the convex hull. But in general, except for special cases, in general, we can't compute the convex hull. Now for OPF, as far as I know, there's no such result. It would be nice, perhaps there's some structure in OPF that allow us to do something like that, at least in, under certain conditions. But I know of no results of that sort. And if I don't know whether it's possible. Certainly, there are special cases where indeed it is possible that you can get the convex hull as your realization. But in general, even for OPF, that doesn't seem easy. But that would be nice.
Yeah, because it's difficult to see how this volume is augmenting as you do different relaxations. So you don't visualize that clearly. The other problem is, once you solve the relaxed problem, it's always this issue of, you know, if you are not able to fall into the original feasible set, non-convex feasible set, then ideally one would like to project the solution of the relaxed problem into the original non-convex set in a way somehow that the cost function, you know, you try to, I don't know how to explain, but you need to go project on that non-convex set in a way that respects the cost or the objective. So, but that looks very complicated, right?
That looks very complicated, at least there's no theory. What people have tried in the ground itself is that you get a non-random one solution, you use that as a starting point and run your favorite nonlinear algorithm, say Newton-Raphson. And that will give you typically, no guarantee, but it will typically give you a feasible point. And empirically, if we look at actual test systems and so on, the feasible point has a very good performance. The gap between the cost of that feasible point and the realization is typically less than 1%. And therefore, there's no theory, unfortunately, but empirically it seems to work well. There's also evidence, and that can be made precise, that the non-convexity, on the one hand, OPF has been known to be very difficult. It tends to have very U condition. It is very U conditioned. On the other hand, there seems to be evidence that suggests the non-convexity of OPF seems to be a simple sort, such as, it's not always true, except for some special case, such as you get a convex shell without the interior, for example. Now that statement can actually, that structure can be made precise in some, say, radio networks.
Hello, and thank you for a nice presentation. I had a few questions first. In the very beginning, up to my understanding, and correct me if it's a misunderstanding, the SJ seemed to me like the net injection from each bus.
Yes.
So why did you put a limit on it? You may need to have a limit maybe on the generation, but not the net injection.
Right. So two comments. One is that, for example, the net injection could be this generation. Let's say there's only generator, but not load. Or it can be load, and the load has a bounds on how much they can consume. Even if they are both generation and load, the net, if they are bounds on the generation and a bounds on the load, their net will also have a bound. The second comment is that mathematically, if there's no constraint, it can be minus infinity and positive infinity. So that's fine.
Okay, so what would be the problem if we have plus infinity generation and plus infinity load in a single bus?
So mathematically is actually a good thing, which means the particular sufficient conditions that I described, that if the sufficient condition is satisfied, then the SOCP relaxation is guaranteed to work. Now, if you don't have constraints, so it's always minus infinity or positive infinity, then that condition will always be satisfied.
Like more mathematical constraints rather than technical. Okay, thank you.
We have time for one question more. Any?
Here.
Phase directly, even
Right.
though that would not lead to a...
Sure. So the question is the lower bound, upper bound on the complex number. What does that mean? It's just a notational simplification. It actually means two sets of constraints.
Right.
There's a lower bound, upper bound on the real part, and there's a lower bound, upper bound on the imaginary part.
Yes. So my question was more about if that is that what you need, because these complex numbers are representatives of the amplitude and phase of a sinusoidal signal somewhere, right? For a sinusoidal.
Right. So for example, if Sj represents the generation,
Yeah.
and there may be a bound on the real power generation and the bound on the reactive power generation. But you also ask, well, what about a bound on, say, the magnitude?
Yeah.
You can put that in. So that, again, will be a quadratic constraint. So one part of the quadratic constraint will be convex, the other part will be non-convex, but you can relax it, so on. Yeah. So you could include those kind of constraints. In fact, for some constraints such as, say, line limits, and you will get into those kind of constraints.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.